But what if someone remembers history alright, just the wrong parts? President Trump's latest tariff policies seem like a history lesson gone wrong. Instead of learning from past mistakes, he's doubling down on economic strategies that have already failed, both in the 19th century and even in his own first term. Only 45% of Americans know how tariffs work, according to Ipsos. Despite this, many Americans seem to want tariffs, including President Trump, who may have won nearly 50% of the popular vote based on the promises to impose blanket tariffs. Today, let's break down what tariffs are, the good, the bad, and the ugly that come with them, and whether the criticism of Trump's 25% tariffs on Canada and Mexico and additional 10% in China are justified. Hey, if you're new here, this is Pawan Pantha with Facts and Opinions, and we break down the why behind the global events, current affairs, and everything between economy and history. And if you like this kind of content, consider giving us a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel. A tariff is a tax on imported goods paid for by the domestic buyers like Walmart, which passes this cost on to their consumers. A significant portion of these imports come from China, Mexico, and Canada. The language in Trump's executive order uses tariffs to push Canada and Mexico to increase border security against illegal drugs. This isn't just a trade war, it's a war in drugs, or so they say. Peter Navarro, the senior trade counselor for President Trump, explicitly mentioned the case against Canada was a drug war and not a trade war.
Is the president fighting a drug war? This is not a trade war.
He also goes on to say that it's also a terrorist war and a border invasion war, citing national security is the only way to impose tariffs on the two other signatories of USMCA without blatantly violating this deal that Trump himself signed in 2018. Hey, just a side note, USMCA, the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, replaced the NAFTA, North American Free Trade, which was signed into law back in 1993 under Bill Clinton. The ulterior motive of protectionism, however misguided, is not discussed, at least in this executive order. So first, let's take this order at its face value and establish if this measure so extreme against an ally that has fought with the United States in every single war since their independence was warranted in the first place. According to this data published by the Drug Enforcement Administration, only 43 pounds of fentanyl was seized in the northern border in 2024, compared to the 21,100 pounds at the US-Mexico border. While I concede 43 pounds is still too many when it comes to a lethal drug such as fentanyl, I'm sure there are other ways than going on a rampage of a trade war against your closest ally, literally and figuratively, to ask for better coordination to control over the border by enhancing operational coordination with the Canadian counterparts. Except now here's the very interesting part. Canada had already saw the need of added resources and coordination with the Americans to secure the US-Canada border and passed this $1.3 billion bill to detect and disrupt the fentanyl trade, and enhancing operational coordination with the US officials back in December of 2024, before Trump ever took the office. Correct me if I'm wrong, but as I understand, Christianity strongly recommends loving your neighbor. And when that neighbor is as kind as and as compassionate as Canada, I'd hope Trump would show at least some reverence to them. And it could be great if it came with the side of not asking them to become the 51st state of the United States, which it reportedly did on call with the Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau after imposing these tariffs. Let's now shift gears and examine the economic motivation behind these tariffs. Like I said at the beginning, it is apparent that the motive of these tariffs is protectionism, despite what rhetoric the White House may choose to pursue. Let's examine this for a minute.
President McKinley, William McKinley, highly underrated, has not been properly recognized. William McKinley is an example. He was a big tariff president. He was a strong believer in tariffs.
William McKinley, the 25th President of the United States, was a staunch advocate of protectionism. Before becoming president, he served as a congressman and championed high tariffs to protect US industries from foreign competition. And note, this was before he became president. Trump mentioned McKinley 3 times in his inauguration, highlighting McKinley's protectionist policies. McKinley is also known for starting American imperialism in the late 19th century, acquiring territories like the Philippines and the Puerto Rico. And I did not take President Trump to be an avid reader of presidential history, so I was initially reluctant to read too much into it. But now the choice, I think, was deliberate. But here lies the ultimate irony of Trump's figurative love affair with William McKinley. While it's true that McKinley was heavily in favor of tariff in 1890 when he legislated in favor of up to 50% tariffs on foreign goods, in 1890 he was merely a congressman, a powerful one at that as a chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee. But because of the nationwide recession, which saw working class people suffer, McKinley essentially walked back his tariffs when he became the president in 1897 by adopting reciprocity, which means partaking in mutually beneficial trade agreements with other countries. A contemporary example of this is the USMCA. Almost a century ago, President Roosevelt attributed the Great Depression to the sky-high tariffs, which invited retaliation and suffocated investment. It then took decades of global effort and led by America to alleviate the tariffs and take the American as well as the world economy to greater heights. McKinley's era of protectionism echoes the disastrous 1930 Smoot-Hawley Tariff, which passed in 1930 during the Great Depression, is often cited as a disastrous example of protectionism. Smoot-Hawley Tariff worsened the Great Depression by triggering retaliatory tariffs, skyrocketing unemployment, and deepening poverty. And now see this speech made by President Reagan.
Free trading nations prosper while protectionist countries fall behind. America's most recent experiment with protectionism was a disaster for the working men and women of this country. When Congress passed the Smoot-Hawley Tariff in 1930, we were told that it would protect America from foreign competition and save jobs in this country. The same line we hear today. The actual result was the Great Depression, the worst economic catastrophe in our history. 1 out of 4 Americans were thrown out of work. 2 years later, when I cast my first ballot for president, I voted for Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who opposed protectionism and called for the repeal of that disastrous tariff. Ever since that time, the American people have stayed true to our heritage by rejecting the siren song of protectionism. In recent years, the trade deficit led some misguided politicians to call for protectionism, warning that otherwise we would lose jobs. But they were wrong again. In fact, the United States not only didn't lose jobs, we created more jobs than all the countries of Western Europe, Canada, and Japan combined. The record is clear that when America's total trade has increased, American jobs have also increased. And when our total trade has declined, so have the number of jobs. Part of the difficulty in accepting the good news about trade is in our words. We too often talk about trade while using the vocabulary of war. In war, for one side to win, the other must lose. But commerce is not warfare. Trade is an economic alliance that benefits both countries. There are no losers, only winners, and trade helps strengthen the free world.
What a liberal quack. Even a conservationist as Reagan saw tariffs as a hindrance to prosperity. But Trump's tariffs risk repeating these mistakes against all of history's warnings. Unsurprisingly, we don't even need to go that far for history lessons. Tariffs imposed by Trump himself in 2018-2019 introduced almost a dollar-to-dollar increment in consumer price as to the increased tariffs. In 2018, Trump imposed tariffs on washing machines, sparking a 12% price increase for consumers. Not just with washers, but also with dryers, mind you. Only because they're sold in sets. For every job created by the tariffs, consumers paid $820,000 in increased prices. Tariffs raise prices, reduce competition, and often harm the very people they are meant to protect. With inflation already high, additional tariffs may push us toward another economic downturn. Not to mention the increased manufacturing cost that US companies had to face as the direct result of increased tariff Trump imposed against steel and aluminum in 2018, later reversed by President Biden. Trump has again reinstated those tariffs on steel and aluminum again while flying into the Super Bowl 59. They go into effect on March 12, 2025. Like it or not, even the sparingly used tariffs during Trump's first term have led to the inflationary economy that preceded even bigger consequences felt after the COVID pandemic. Suffice it to say, tariffs are usually followed by bad economic outcomes. And I, for one, am not looking forward to another historical period of depression in the United States. Trump's plan to impose tariffs as an economic tool to generate higher revenue for the federal government could look like a good idea on a glance. But a deeper examination of data suggests tariffs only made 1.8% of total revenue US had generated in 2023. Increasing tariff to help alleviate the income taxes, which contributed about $2.2 trillion in revenue in the same year, is either merely just a pipe dream or a ploy to win over trusting voters. Tariffs are usually not the right approach to a drug war or even to solve the trade deficit. Even though economists consider tariff to be a blunt tool, if used surgically, tariffs can have some benefits, such as job creation and reducing trade imbalance and protecting certain industries. For example, US in the early 1800s, when it was transitioning from a agricultural economy to industrial economy, Congress passed 20 to 25% tariffs in 1816, which focused on imported textiles and iron goods, which helped protect the growing industries. As a more recent example, China comes to mind. China has transitioned from a low-cost manufacturing hub to a high-tech manufacturing giant starting in the early 2000s. To achieve this goal, China imposed targeted tariffs against foreign companies, coupled it with subsidies and other industrial policies to protect and develop certain high-tech industries that focus on renewable energy, semiconductors, and EVs, among others. Blanket tariffs, however, can only bring short-term pain to the consumers, especially the middle class, which already feels squeezed more than enough. With core consumer prices already on the rise and the global economy so integrated and the North American manufacturing codependent on the free trade agreement that has now existed for over 30 years, the risk of the US economy capitulating into a greater recession is more pronounced than ever. The Friday of January 31st, the stock market showed a downward turn as soon as the tariffs were announced. By following Monday, the tariffs were already given temporary pause, and the market again immediately responded positively. The official narrative will most likely always remain that it was because the US was able to get valuable concessions from Mexico and Canada. But it is widely reported that Trump judges himself through the prism of stock market performance. To a hammer, every problem is a nail. International diplomacy cannot be reduced to the hammer and nail mindset, where trade war is the only solution. These tariffs on Canada and Mexico are set to resume back on March 4th, while the extra 10% levied on China are still in place. Far be from me to tell President Trump on how to finesse the art of the deal, but China has already announced countermeasures, not just with retaliatory tariffs, but also investigations into American companies within China's borders. Canada and Mexico will be certainly preparing to make more offerings to appease Trumpian ego, but they will be prioritizing to reduce the dependence on a fickle and erratic neighbor. This cannot be a good thing, at least from the American perspective. If history is a guide, which it usually is, these tariffs won't just hurt China, Mexico, and Canada. They will hurt American consumers, businesses, and workers. In a global economy, economic wars don't have winners, just losers. And like always, the biggest loser might be the American lower and middle class. Facts and opinions.